Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of our events calendar, where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums. As is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, we are celebrating the publication of the book Chinese Whispers Towards a Transpacific Poetics. It is authored by Yunte Huang and published by the University of Chicago Press. We have had the great pleasure of hosting Professor Huang in the past. We're happy to have him back once again after many moons. In Chinese Whispers, he explores the dynamics of poetry and poetics in the age of globalization, and in particular, questions of translatability, universality, and risk in the Transpacific context. Professor Huang examines the numerous contact zones between Anglophone and Sinophone worlds and explores how poetry both enables and complicates the Transpacific production of meaning. Professor Huang is a poet, educator, and historian. He is a professor of English at the University of California in Santa Barbara. He's taught at Harvard University and has received fellowships from the Society for the Humanities and the Guggenheim Foundation. He is the best-selling author whose works include Transpacific Imaginations, Charlie Chan, The Untold Story, and Inseparable, the original Siamese twins and their rendezvous with American history. Professor Huang will be joined this evening in conversation by Charles Bernstein. Charles Bernstein is the Donald T. Regan Professor Emeritus of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is also co-editor of Pen Sound and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the author of the books Topsy Turvy, Pitch of Poetry, Recalculating, and Near Miss, all published by the University of Chicago Press. In 2019, he was awarded the prestigious Bollingen Prize for Poetry from Yale University. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Chinese Whispers, as well as some of the other books by Dr. Huang and Dr. Bernstein's work. So we're also going to be having a Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please do post your questions and comments in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard from where we will locate them. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to Yunte Huang and Charles Bernstein. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights.
It's great to be here, whatever here is, because I'm broadcasting from Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn. And where are you, Yunte? You look very far away.
Yes, I just arrived in Hong Kong 3 days ago. Yes.
So it's really a triangulation of the three places, which is partly what your book is about or suggests. And it's good to see some various friends from different places. I thought I would ask you to start by reading a poem that you print. Now, you don't give the authorship of the poem. I have my suspicions, and I had my forensic team go over it to look for certain syntactic markers, but you don't say. But in any case, the poem is called M.I.A., or is it called Mia, like Mamma Mia, the great pop hit?
Right, or I could be missing in action in some ways. So, well, thank you all for being here. I see many familiar faces or names and great friends and everybody. Writing this book, I want to begin by saying, in a minute, I'm going to read this per Charles's request, but I just want to, preface it, the reading by saying, it's really a deeply personal kind of academic book, if that's an oxymoron, because disinterest is always, I guess, the hallmark of scholarship, so-called. But this book is really, if you read it, it's full of anecdotes, and it's a lot, of course, about my experience crossing the ocean, especially crossing the language boundary and looking at poetry from different angles as propaganda or kind of depersonalized or depoliticized or whatever you want to have it. And of course, it's also about misinformation or disinformation and propaganda and all that. So, in one particular chapter called "The Chinese Whispers," actually about the future of meaning in the age of information, so I quoted myself without really proper attribution, but I footnoted by saying that in the spirit of this book, which deals with the Chinese whispers, gossip, hearsay, and unreliability versus rationalist verifiability and accurate information, the poet for mere or MIA shall remain anonymous. So I guess it's one of the rare occasions an academic could get away by, quoting something without really voluntarily revealing the the source. But anyway, so here it goes. For me, Made in America, a song of love that goes nowhere. I want to bask in your basket, toil in your toilet, ski on your skin, nap in your napkin, chat in your chateau, pace in your space. I want to be the loom in your pantaloon, the brass on your brassiere, and the linger on your lingerie. I'm big on bigamy, but tiny under scrutiny. I want to be the flue in your flute, bone in your trombone, pep in your trumpet, note in your piano, bug in your bugle. If there's a lie in the lean, I'll find you a law in the floor. Become a rabbi for your rabbit, bamboo for your bamboozle. I want to be the ring of your spring, the sum of your summer, all your fall, wind of your winter. But would you be the can of my canto, net of my sonnet, ant in my chant, lad in my ballad, dog in my doggerel? I yearn for your feelings, but flee from my earnings. So there it goes.
Now, is that poem in Chinese?
Well,
or is it in Brooklynese? Or is it in Tijuana Spanish?
Well, like they say, this great Japanese tea master about 100 years ago in Boston, Kagakuro, I think that's his name. He was wearing exotic Japanese costumes, Japanese clothes, but they look at it as costumes. And so American asked him, like, what kind of knees are you? Are you Japanese, Chinese, or Vietnamese?
Well,
and he responded by saying, what kind of key are you? Like, Yankee, donkey, or monkey? But well, you're right, actually. I wrote it. The reason I quote myself in this case, not for kind of egocentric kind of gesture, but actually, I wrote this poem as a Chinese writing in English. As you see, of course, Charles, and this is a paragraph. So, anagrams just use all the letters scrambled, but paragraph using only part of it. And I'm attracted to paragraph was because of I started out as a Chinese speaker, and Chinese, as the panel would say, this ideographic component of Chinese, and actually I kind of carry it over. It's part of my luggage, that I kind of smuggled into English. So I was writing English, or writing Chinese in English, or vice versa. So that's exactly what I was trying to do.
Of course, my obsession, and I mean that clinically, with the paragrams comes from a different place, although I don't know what it is. But that's part of what your book is about, is the nature and, in a way, the mystery and the compelling attraction of paragrams, anagrams, puns, wordplay, in terms of the echoes, and specifically the echoes of Chinese and English as the two languages that you have. But so what about these echoes and paragrams makes them Chinese whispers? The title of the book. Why does that expression come into being? Now that's I would point out, because you noted in the book that they are called Chinese whispers. That's not something that you're inventing. But I'm asking you, why Chinese? what is Chinese from a Western point of view about this kind of word play or word sound echo?
That's my whispering. Yes. Can you?
Oh. Okay,
Of course,
so he
Chinese
says,
whisper. Chinese whisper, of course, is a children's game. It's on the telephone game, right? As a term, as a concept, as an English term, it started out quite some time ago. I think it started out as a derogative term to describe the babbling of Chinese, that incomprehensible to Europeans. When they couldn't understand Chinese speakers, they said this Chinese whisper. And interestingly, in mid-century, mid-20th century, the term picked up kind of more kind of currency in the age of Cold War. And that's why the synonyms for telephone game is like Russian telephone, or not Russian roulette. So it has a kind of Cold War connotation. For me, this term kind of captures many of the moments, kind of almost like Chinese whispers moments in this Anglo-Chinese kind of exchange of poetry, and with as a pound, but also went back to like Marco Polo about money and the acoustic, as Susan Howe would say, the acoustic truth in some ways. And so I'm attracted not by disinformation, but I'm attracted by the fact that to a great extent, what we are pursuing in poetry in terms of surplus, like the remainder, the echolalia and all that, how eerily kind of close to the kind of propaganda game played during the Cold War. And that's why Olson plays a significantly in the book, in the sense he worked for the office of what is a wartime information, and he eventually quit because he was I guess fed up with the kind of use of language for disinformation, and he returned to this kind of the embodiment of language with typewriter and everything. So there are many kind of strands of stories I want to weave together by using this term.
We have the other game, the Chinese whispers, the game where you whisper something to one person and then they whisper it to somebody else. And in the end, you have something entirely different and unexpected. Also a name of a poem by John Ashbery, as you mentioned, and also perhaps a way of understanding both translation and poesis, poetic composition, as you say in the book. But and I use the term nowadays echo poetics, ECHO, very much along the lines of what you're talking about in this book. There's a game that we play as in America, often in a swimming pool, where one person shouts out Marco,
Polo,
Marco, and I guess you have your eyes blindfolded. One person is blindfolded, and that's the way through echolocation they hear the other person. It becomes extremely resonant in your book, since you have an extraordinary discussion of Marco Polo and sound. But it made me feel like there must be a connection between this very common game. I'm sure many of the listeners will play this game, Marco Polo, and you figure out where the person is, to your discussion of sound in Marco Polo. But there probably is no connection, in fact, between those two things.
Well, I mean, once again, as a non-native speaker, I'm often puzzled by certain terms. The first time I heard this Marco Polo game played in a pool, and I thought they're playing water polo, right?
Water.
Got has to be some connections, So yes, I'm totally aware of, in the sense of, the mistranslation, right? That at the end of the game, if the game is successful, then the message has to be totally unrecognizable compared to the start out. So in other words, this is a story of mistranslation. So, Charles, once I think you said something like, "I've never seen a cliche I don't like," right?
Right, which is actually an echo of Will Rogers. And he
Right.
says, I never met
But
a
for
man.
me, I feel like there's never a mistranslation that I don't like.
Yes, well, it's the same. You know, speaking of which, right within the block of me is an Italian restaurant called Marco Polo, too. So there's another echo. But let's back up. So this begins. I mean, that's why I wanted you to read that poem in the beginning, MIA, Missing in Action, Mia, Made in America. These are the kind of echoes that you're interested in, but across the language barriers. So talk about what you mean by the translocal pidgin versus basic English. This is a very central theme in the book, but it's I think a good way to continue the conversation. What is translocal pidgin?
Okay.
And how does that contrast itself with basic English?
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, Basic English, as you know, is this kind of utopian language program promoted by I.A. Richards and C.K. Ogden in the early 20th century to make English, global, easy to understand, and so they reduced the English vocabulary to about only 850. So it becomes so simple that everybody can learn it within a few months, and then we can communicate perfectly with each other, and therefore we don't fight any wars anymore. And it's a very kind of utopian dream, but of course it rides on the cultural power and authority of English, and it actually failed in China. And I. Richards came to China, tried to promote it, and tried to get schools to teach basic English in the English, classes. But for me, growing up in southern China, for instance, and that's why I'm so attached to this kind of local dialect and all that, in a sense that I grew up in a region, Wenzhou, Zhejiang, where the town actually speaks 3 different dialects, and at least 3 actually. But growing up, I spoke only 1 dialect, so I was not able to understand the other 2. But it hovers as echolalia in a sense, right? Echo poetics. I can hear certain terms, and like when you trade with somebody, buy some stuff, and the person selling your stuff actually does not speak my dialect, but somehow you figure out a way to communicate, and that's how pidgin came out, right? In Hawaii, Creole, in different regions have different pidgins. So I'm attracted to that in the sense of how people improvise and compromise in their interaction, rather than say hoping for this kind of utopian kind of perfect communication, because perfect communication is basically a engaged communication with negotiation back and forth. And that's so this whole line of pursuit I see from basic English down to, say, today, Google translation, and all the machine translation, all that. Again, it's the pipe dream of this communicating information directly and cleanly. And for us, for poetry, of course, poetry is noise, it's echo and all that. So back to this pidgin, and this particular case that Charles mentioned is, I'm talking about Yunte Huang, who actually became quite critical of I. Richards' attempt to popularize basic English in China. And Yunte Huang, once again, coming from growing up in the South, and he spoke Fukienese and other dialects as well. So if you grow up,
I don't think you're allowed to say that, by the way.
What's that?
I don't think you're allowed to say Fukienese.
Oh, Fukienese. So no. Yeah, I actually know a little Fukienese. Absolutely, yes. Because when I was growing up, the weather report, local weather report, was actually broadcasting 3 different dialects, and that's how you pick up certain things. And I mean, it's quite common, say, in Europe, right? A lot of Europeans are multilingual and all that. So in that sense, I kind of am always attracted by this, by a certain degree of incomprehensibility that you struggle with it and you live with it. And so that's where I see, poetry becomes interesting for me. Not something you completely understand, but somehow you struggle with it, and sometimes frustrated by it as well.
Your book is filled with remarkable autobiographical reflections on some of the issues that you're raising. And one of them is the relation of what you're talking about to listening to Voice of America in China as a child on the radio. Can you tell us
Oh,
that?
well, yeah, I mean, that's the beginning of my encounter with English in some ways, or that kind of a moment of awakening. So like all other school kids in China, I started learning English when I was about 11. But you can't really learn anything from class those days because every classroom is like a zoo, and very few people are genuinely interested in studying English, although it was required. And so this was around, in the waning days of Mao's China. And every household, we didn't have television set yet. But each household has a transistor radio that enables you to listen to all sorts of shortwave, radio programs and all that. And so one night I was playing with a kind of battered, transistor radio abandoned by my grandfather. And he moved on to a newer one. And so he just left behind this kind of old battered one. And I was playing with it. And then I was just, turning the dial up and down. And I came to a point where suddenly there's a man speaking in called special English. It's called like this is the Voice of America, VOA, Voice of America, broadcasting in special English. And it's called special English because it actually is modeled after basic English. The vocabulary is slightly bigger. It's about like 1,500 words, but supposedly special English that that each sentence means just one thing, and that's its claim. And how can that be, really? But it's that, once again, that's the dream, the perfect communication. Of course, I didn't realize, was not aware that VOA was actually so-called enemies, right? Because VOA was a propaganda machine sponsored by the State Department of the United States. I had no clue at the time. I was just picking up English. And so you can say I was brainwashed by the propaganda, but I learned a great deal of English from it. So I ended up listening to a lot of kind of illegal radios, such as the broadcast from Taiwan. And what I like about it is not the propaganda, the intentional disinformation. Is actually they have English programs. And so they will, they run a whole day of disinformation, but they'll include half an hour English lessons for people who are like me. And so I was hooked. And that's really my beginning, I say, with the English language.
You talk about the vernacular imagination. What do you mean by the vernacular imagination?
Well, a simple example is that money, all currencies are not translated, right? You say lira, you say Chinese yuan, or US dollar, or a German mark. The monetary unit is not translated, just like the names, right? Your Charles Bernstein, translated into Chinese is Charles Bernstein. It's always sound translation, homophonic translation.
Yeah.
And so from the poetic perspective, the reason, there must be a reason that you cannot imagine the worth of something unless it's rendered in your own local currency. So in that sense, the vernacular is tied to money. And that particular case, I write about it in the Marco Polo case, right? Because Marco Polo, when he saw really the beginning that the Great Khan was making paper money, he took tree bark and turned into pulp, and then it turned into paper, and he put a stamp on it, and that's money. And Marco Polo was amazed by that kind of intangible, value, how the way it was produced. And he said, wow, this guy is the richest person in the world because there's endless supply of money, produced this way. But what's interesting is that Marco Polo always begged his readers, always had to say, this object is worth, let's say, how many lira. He always had to render everything in local currency in order for his reader to understand what's the worth of this object in China. So that reminds me of that, in the sense of that I'm trying to, or in order to understand anything in the world, you need to use your own local currency, right? Where you come from. And it's like first time I was looking at a Hershey bar, chocolate bar. I just arrived in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I was doing laundry in the dorm room. And when I was waiting for my laundry to dry, I was staring at this, vending machine. In the vending machine, that was like a Hershey bar. It cost like 50 cents, right, per Hershey bar. And I was doing this kind of Marco Polo sort of translation because at the time, 1991, 50 cents will be like a 1 week of Chinese workers' wages at the time, not now, but at the time. So when you do that kind of, local currency kind of vernacular translation, you see how things change their values. And that for me is my first lesson kind of vernacular translation, is looking at a Hershey bar.
Right.
And
so that's what you talk about in terms of the cosmopolitan and also the translocal, and contrasting that with basic. So this also leads you to a kind of appreciation of Pidgin and in particular Chinglish. However, with Chinglish, many people would say that it's bad, it's degraded, it's a kind of yellow face. It's the kind of thing that Hollywood has characters like Charlie Chan. And hey, you wrote a book about Charlie Chan and heard about this. So there is a pushback against this kind of Chinglish. And it reminds me of something else you said, which was extraordinary in the same section where you talk about it, where you talk about Heidegger. So there's these incredible sort of leaps from the vernacular of your kid listening on the radio to the Voice of America to your very insightful discussions of Heidegger on technology. There he's talking about the typewriter. I want to come back to the typewriter in a second because it's very important in the book. But he refers to the typewriter as a degraded instrumentalizing of the word to a means of communication, making words just form instrumentalized communication because you remove the word from the hand, from handwriting, such as the Chinese script that we're seeing in back of us. And it relates also in this way to almost a kind of orientalizing in that you feel in some Western thought in Heidegger. But this idea of the degraded, that Chinglish is degraded, that the typewriter is degraded, how do you respond to that charge? That on the one hand, fear, on the other hand, philosophy.
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, in terms of cultural or racial encounter, since I wrote a whole book about it, if I can summarize briefly, I like the fact it's for the comedic, a mockery in a sense of it's a mockery, right? It's a wide mockery of Chinese speakers. But on the other hand, I want to turn the table and say, sometimes it's counter mockery. So Charlie Chan represents to me in a sense of, because when you call something Pidgin, it means you have, some kind of standard to look up to, as Henry James would say, there's a tone standard even. Like, after Buffalo, Charles, you must know, when I first went to like Cambridge, right? And, everywhere I go, people all speak like faintly British English, right? And there was like, for a long time, at the time there was a dean who spoke like faint British English. And I thought, wow, this guy must be British. But turns out,
he's important.
Sorry,
he was important. You confused the two, or he
right. So for a while I thought he was British, but turned out, if I may say so, the motherfucker was actually from St. Louis, just like T.S. Eliot. So in that sense, that what is Pidgin, what is standard, what is the tone standard, so-called, it's really up for grab. So in that sense, I understand people may be offended by, say, the characterization of Charlie Chan, but I beg to differ in some sense. But also I want to add, if Charlie Chan represents a kind of Chinese American perception of the Chinese language, as a Pound represents the other, right? It's kind of high and low culture. So all these kind of two strands of Americana now actually make me want to write my next book. Actually, it's about Confucius. So Confucius really captures Charlie Chang and Ezra Pound. And I really came to Confucius not as a philosopher or somebody who's steeped in Chinese history, but really from Ezra Pound and then Charlie Chang. So back to your next question about technology and Heidegger. I mean, Eleni here must remember Charles once told us about this great Heidegger story anecdote. I think you made it up, but it was in your seminar. You said, you know what I'm talking about, right? So dinner was ready, and Heidegger's, Frau was calling like, Martin, time for dinner. Yeah, and Heidegger was poring over, this text, ancient, Greek text, right? So like, wait a minute, there is a diacritical mark on this letter. Usually there is no diacritical mark. It must be important. And so the Frau came over, the wife came over and looked at the text, and she just threw it away. So a speck of dust. And now, Heidegger can go and eat. But the diacritical mark is important in the sense that it's the embodiment, it's the dirt, it's the actual, right? So go back to the typewriter story. And we all know that, Heidegger, kind of wrote against the typewriter, taking, I guess, writing away from the body. And I'm somewhat sympathetic with that view, although in that particular chapter, when I write about the Chinese typewriter, actually Lin Yutang, again, the hero in my first chapter, became a hero again, in a sense. He was incorporating the aesthetics of Chinese calligraphy into his design of a Chinese typewriter. As an engineering project, it failed. I mean, he succeeded in making a machine, but it didn't sell. But the machine was made. But back to this kind of idea of handwriting versus typewriter, of course, Olson argued that typewriter is an instant personal recorder, and that makes him already different, kind of a better understanding what typewriter is. But for me personally, once again, it's kind of personal anecdotal thing I didn't actually include in my in this Chinese Whispers, this book, is the sense that one reason I turned to English was not just because of my encounter, kind of lucky, encounter with the Voice of America, but was because of my handwriting in Chinese was horrible. It still is horrible. And given this long aesthetic tradition in China, artistic tradition, because penmanship basically is your character, right? If you have a kind of messy handwriting, it means you have a messy personality and all that. And only later, so English gave me a new life, that I can try a different kind of handwriting, and I can even use typewriter, because when I was growing up, there is no Chinese typewriter. Chinese typewriter is like a machine, it's like a factory. So you always had to handwrite and all that. Today, of course, with an iPhone and a computer, but I find kind of consolation in the fact that Alan Turing, for instance, very famously, right, when he was growing up in prep school, his handwriting was really messy, and he got physically abused by the teacher over and over again. After one beating, I think one time he went to the riverside and cried there, but he made a promise to himself that one day he will invent a machine that can get him away from handwriting, in a sense. And lo and behold, he actually did invent the computer, for that matter.
Well, since we're talking about the typewriter, it becomes a fundamental question for Chinese writing, and therefore for your book about Chinese language versus the instrumentalizing of the Western alphabet. Of course, because it's a non-alphabetic culture, it doesn't easily work within a keyboard. Now, of course, the keyboards are so ubiquitous that it to some degree forces Chinese speakers, who are a large part of the world population, to translate what they're doing into a keyboard that doesn't seem really to work for Chinese. This is the basic issue that's faced, and you have it, as with everything in the book, a fascinating rethinking of what those issues are. But one of the things you could say along the lines of basic is, what difference does it make what the character is, or the Chinese written character, or even the sound of Chinese. It's the information we want. It's what you're saying. It's the facts. A fist, no matter how you say it, is still going to punch you in the face. That's what's real. What is all this hang up on sound and on
The shape
and shape and calligraphy on the one hand, and then why not, as you say, just make a phonetic Chinese? What would be lost? And then the question is, what was the solution that you talk about of the Chinese typewriter, which
Right.
is quite
So,
an amazing
I
thing.
mean, I was using Chinese as an example. That's why I call the Chinese mode of language, right? It's coding. It's basically, you can talk about Mayan writing or Egyptian hieroglyph. And despite the fact, so-called Egyptian hieroglyph turned out to be alphabetic, whereas Mayan turned out to be syllabic, that you cannot, discard the information that is embedded in the images, right? So that's called the so-called surplus, and that's why I'm called it the Chinese mode of coding. So many of the things is actually sort of like not just translation but transcoding. When you recode English into Chinese, it's a different kind of coding system. And so I'm using kind of natural language, mixing up basically artificial language like computer language with natural language to show that in the old sense of Robert Frost, poetry was lost in translation. Poetry was lost in transcoding in some sense. So to talk about this, the sound and the shape is otherwise, why would we even want to study poetry? We could just read a New Yorker poem to get what we want from poetry, I guess.
I mean, you go back several times to an image, not an image, to an idea which relates to basic and relates to this instrumentation, that language is just a data set, and so you can put it in any language you want. It's the same data set. Right. And it's really, this is what you're arguing against in Chinese echoes. I remember when I was in college, it drove me crazy that the great logician Willard Quine basically had this idea that it was the null case. What would be different? What would be the remainder significant about the sound, or even to a greater extent for him, the visual appearance of the language was insignificant. But your book is all about how significant it is. So tell us how. I was just going to say, tell us how the Chinese typewriter was invented. It's almost like inventing the computer.
Right. Well, Lin Yutang, he made a lot of money from his bestseller, My Country and My People. And then he foolishly invested all the money and borrowed even more money to try to design this Chinese typewriter. As you pointed out, Chinese is not alphabetic language, and the keyboarding, the kind of keyboarding we have, simply does not work for Chinese typewriting. So Lin Yutang very kind of ingeniously borrowed from Chinese calligraphy, the aesthetics, the principles, the strokes. And so he realized how a Chinese keyboarding could work, but not following. So he basically turned the table around, because one of the reasons the Western alphabetic typewriting did not work for Chinese for a long time was because the engineers tried to accommodate, tried to adapt Chinese to the alphabetic language. And Lin Yutang actually turned around and look at the other way. And so the Chinese typewriter actually can use it not just to type Chinese, but also type Russian or other alphabetic languages. And he took that from, again, the principle. I can't explain in kind of technical detail, but the idea is like, just behind you, Charles, is the calligraphy, it's the strokes. So he turned English alphabet, and that's A becomes different strokes. And he figured out how to do this kind of stroking on the keyboard. And so the keyboard he designed was quite, it's really a work of, I guess, the words of our old friend and my old mentor, Dennis Terlock, is a really work of ethnopoetics. There's the technology, or Jared Rothenberg will say what is the technician of the sacred. So Lin Yutang did this kind of ethno-poetic approach by really engaging calligraphy as a technology. And that really, I guess, presents a kind of alternative to what Heidegger understood to be, this kind of disembodiment of typewriting. So that to me is in case of poetry as poesis, it's a real making, right? Yeah.
Because Heidegger, as well as those people who dislike pigeons, have an idea of purity, whereas in Chinese whispers, it's really impurity and miscegenation, and in this case, technological hybridization that is is the given of what human interaction is, not the purity. The purity is what's alienated. And one way that you bring this out very beautifully in the book is to talk about tones. I mean, so the idea of the vernacular imagination or language imagination is not that you can't translate it. In a way, you must translate it. You do translate it, and it comes out weird on the other side. But that you also respect or recognize the materiality of difference, of the difference of sound, and also of visual representation in terms of verbal language. So you have a fantastic example of this in the story of Mr. Xi, and it's about tones, which are and you mentioned you used the word tones a few times already in this conversation, but tones are something that for vernacular American English speakers are not that significant, although they're probably a lot more significant than we think, because pitch is extremely important in conveying meaning, and gesture, the same word, but it's still more elaborated within Chinese. Would you read that piece and maybe talk about what the significance of that work is?
Well, first of all, I mean, as you know, the Mandarin Chinese has 4 tones. Nga, 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 nga. So without tone, you will not be able to understand what particular word means. So one time I think Rob Wilson is here too. We were sitting on this Pacific Rim research program, and there was one proposal is to redesign the hearing aid. And it turns out, the hearing aid made in America did not work in China because the hearing aid cannot hear tones. And without being able to hear tones, it doesn't work. So they want to solve that problem. And I come from a dialect, Wenzhou dialect has 6 tones, and Cantonese actually have 9 tones, whereas Mandarin Chinese has only 4. And that's one of the reasons, the Chinese language, speaking of Charlie Chang and Pidgin, and the sing-song is always used to describe Chinese language. That's because of the earliest arrivals, immigrants were mostly Cantonese speakers, and their tones, 9 tones. But Americans are into tones too. I mean, like when the kids say, nga, 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 that's, to me, it's totally tonal language, really. So at the end of this book, there's a coda. I use Zhao Yanren, Zhao Yanren was a very famous Chinese linguist, taught at Harvard and eventually taught at Berkeley and retired there. And he was invited to one of these Macy conferences, which basically determined the future of information technology, right? The series of Macy conferences. So as a Chinese linguist, he was invited to attend this 1953 Macy conference at Princeton. And he brought a Chinese gift, which is a sound poem. He's actually, Zhao Yanren's specialty is actually tone, because he strongly believed that the technicians, the people who are involved, inventing a computer, determining the future information technology, were going the wrong way, and they just want to have this kind of perfect information, disembodiment of information. Zhao Yanren insisted on the tone, which is kind of embodiment. So he brought this Chinese gift, which is a poem that he composed himself. It contains 106 Chinese characters, and they're all pronounced as shi, S-H-I, but in different tones. So if I can translate this poem for you first, and then I read the Chinese, otherwise, it'll be just babbling. So in translation, in kind of literal translation, this poem says, Stonehouse poet Mr. Shi was found of lions and resolved to eat 10 lions. The gentleman from time to time went to the market to look for lions. When at 10 o'clock he went to the market, it happened that 10 big lions went to the market. Thereupon, the gentleman looked at the 10 big lions and relying on the momentum of 10 stone arrows, he caused the 10 lions to depart from this world. The gentleman picked up the lions' bodies and went to the stone house. The stone house was wet, and he made the servant try and wipe the stone house. The stone house having been wiped, the gentleman began to try to eat the 10 lions' bodies. When he ate them, he began to realize that those 10 big lions' bodies were actually 10 big stone lions' bodies. Now he began to understand that this was really the fact of the case. Try and explain this matter. So that's the story. Now I read this.
Just intervene here for 1 second. I don't think this is going to show up, but you present it in alphabetic characters, and
with
it ends
the
up
diacritical marks to indicate a tone.
diacritical marks, such as in our story about whisk them away and you can relax. But it looks, of course, like a concrete poem. That's part of your
absolutely. It's the
your
stone lion,
reference, because you speak about Geraldo de Campos or something. It's like a late Noy Grandes poem of just a grid of what would seem to be SHI, she. So translated, you've given us, that's not what it is. And now you're going to read the Chinese of this.
Okay, so here's Zhao Yang's gift to all these revolutionaries of digital information. 时事诗事诗事时诗事实实施是实实是是是诗实实是是是是实实是是是是实是是是实施是实是实是是是实施是是是实是实施是是实是实是是是史是是是实是实是是是史是实是实施施事实史是事实施实事实实施施事实是史是事实事实是是是是 That's the Chinese whispers that ends my book.
We continue talking, but we welcome questions in the chat. I don't see any as of yet, so I will continue on. But if you do type in a question, I will bring it up to Yunte Huang. So immediately connected to this is Pound. Pound figures greatly in the book, and it's the reverse of some of what we're talking about, because it's not Chinese to English, it's English to Chinese. His great attraction for Chinese, unlike a lot of people who've written about Pound and Fenollosa and the misunderstanding of Chinese that was involved by Pound. We do have a question coming up, but I'll read it after you answer this question on Pound. You have always taken in your earlier books a view, as you do about Charlie Chan too, that the misunderstanding was productive, and that it's interesting to take seriously how people misperceive things. And I think anybody listening to your reading of the Shi can't help but see how you project in all kinds of things which are not related to the translation you just gave, and that's why it's an exemplary moment in the book. But you find Pound's interventions in Chinese, even though he didn't quite understand what the written character was, he didn't understand the nature of the syllabic form within the Chinese. He thought it was more pictographic than it was, but quite interesting. And you're certainly not negative about it. So talk a little bit about your casting of Ezra Pound as interlingual and plurilingual, and how he figures for you as this kind of a protean translator.
Right. I mean, pound to me really represents this kind of attempt to understand the other. I mean, Charles, you wrote about this in the sense of pounding fascism, that great essay to point out the conflict, the contradiction between his dream to pursue this kind of perfect model language by plucking examples from all sorts of languages. First of the openness of this poetic model. On the other hand, the inevitability of mistranslation, right? It's not possible. When you recode something, it's a different kind of code. And you will miss something, you'll leave behind something. In order to make your story cohere in your own language, you must have to leave out something or to tweak a little. So that tweaking is creation, right? That's the opportunity. So I'm crossing border constantly. Now especially trying to go across into the mainland. Understand that what you pick up when you go along the way, the baggage or the luggage and the baggage, and they wear you down but they also accompany you. So pound really to me a model. It is kind of cosmopolitanism. To open yourself up to the world, but also here in his case is a tragedy, right? It led to his fascism because he continued to pursue this kind of fascistic kind of authority, which can name things correctly. And for me, again, going back to ethnopoetics and all of that, it's also that we always know things by different names, and that's takes us back to the vernacular earlier. The pidgin and all of that, the necessity to know one thing by different names, and to me, is the pounding lesson.
Right, but and Pound also exceeds his errors in this case by a surplus that he creates as a poet, even though he pushes back against it. You talk about cradalism, and it's a very interesting connection to what you just said. And your cradalism is the idea coming from Socrates, Plato, that words map on to things like objects. Rock is rock, and that there's a fixity. And the whole concept to me of Chinese whispers is that sound rather than sight. That cradalism is an era of taking the visual and the objects seen in the visual field as primary rather than sound, which is always unstable and echoic. And it's a beautiful response to the problems of cradalism, as you just showed in the Pound. Now we have a extreme, as you discuss in your comments about Pound. I should note that account too is imbued with a personal story of your translating the Pisan cantos. So this is the cantos that were written when Pound was a prisoner of war in Italy before he was transported back to the United States and in a cage. And you translate that into Chinese. And the problem you face there is how do you translate the Chinese characters into Chinese? And that really raises, again, a fundamental issue of Chinese whispers. How do you translate the Pound's interest in the Chinese character into Chinese? Well, your publisher, as you say, didn't let you do that. So that was a lost opportunity. There's a very nice comment by Hang Ping Zhu, and I may be pronouncing that name wrong, but which I'm sorry, but I only have the alphabetic there. And he loves the book. And I'm going to translate his question, which is really a wonderful encomium for the book. He finished the book and he's read it, finds it compelling. And he, like me, feels it's the combination of the personal and the research and the theoretical, which works so well, the way in which it's almost like a seamless movement of one from the other. And he speaks, as you did earlier, that he remembers the narration of your childhood experience of waking up to unintelligible dialects in your village. So the whole issue is, what is unintelligible? It's unintelligible by one account of intelligibility, and yet it's the most local thing and entirely intelligible in another. This palpable sense of nostalgia to this quite dreamy scene, if your Voice of America experience, which your book starts with, renders you a cosmopolitan subject, the personal moment of nostalgia for that trans-local experience seems to unsettle that very cosmopolitan subject. So actually, it's wonderful as a writer, I think, or even a reader, to see such a lucid single sentence that that really does convey the complexity of what you're talking about. It's a very good description of what you're doing. So the question is, does this personal moment illustrate what you call, and I asked you about this, the vernacular imagination, giving the local or the folk spaces incredible liberatory or subversive potential? But I would add also that it's also the miscegenated spaces, the translocal, which comes into problems. It's not just the local, but also the way the local gets muddied when it gets into the interference patterns of other locals.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Well, Hangping, thank you. He's my colleague at UCSB, a wonderful writer himself, and also from my province, although we speak different dialects. Yes, all I'm trying to, I think, suggest or point to or argue for in this book is the kind of to quote Malinowski many years ago, is that the meaning of meaningless words, I think vocables, right? I think Eleni here, must know that when you listen to something that sounds like gibberish, but it totally is meaningful in a different way. It's also like magic in some sense. I don't mean to say this kind of in a religious sense, but it's also in the sense of in the embodied sense that when you so growing up in that small town, carpeting this kind of desire for cosmopolitanism going beyond the village was being grounded locally, almost like a sense of Thomas Wolfe, actual North Carolina, everything is grounded locally, or Faulkner. So to me, all these models of world literature, a very catchy term today, are really translocal, right? I mean, talk about Robert Frost, the image of a New England poet became so transcendental and global, but of course it's the market, the literary market that did the work. And the same with language, is through empires and the promotions and the cultural authority and everything that turns something quite local into global in some sense. So yes, by going back to the vernacular, emphasizing the incomprehensibility or the accent or the marked, as Charles, you once said in your seminar, is to try to unsettle somewhat this kind of cosmopolitan, attempt, really.
So I'm going to end with one question about something we didn't discuss, but it's a nice way to end because it moves into a probably unimaginable direction for those who've not read the book and just are hearing it now. But we want to keep this to around 1 hour. But I want to talk about your marvelous discussion of Wallace Stevens. You almost wouldn't expect Wallace Stevens to figure into Chinese whispers, but he does, and he what you say about him is in terms of his being his work in insurance in figuring out the probability of what was going to happen on a job so that it could be insured. And you call this actually the actuarial. It's an actuarial imagination based on risk, a virtual reality in a sense. And this, in your account, becomes a kind of translocal vernacular as well. It has closest to do with what you said about money in Marco Polo, discovering money, how abstraction works, and in Wallace Stevens, and how, in fact, money works also has to do with risk and managing risk, and that this translocal vernacular is, in Stevens's sense, what reality is, not the fist punching you in the face or the drab brick buildings of Reading, Pennsylvania that he grew up in, as he always investigates what's the real. So let's end with you're talking a little bit about what Wallace Stevens has to do with it.
Well, Wallace Stevens, as you point out, as an insurance man, he understands, the power of abstraction, because abstraction is about the control of risk. And today we are living in a world of, not wealth, but in risk. You can be a very rich man, but if you're close to risk, then there's nothing good about it. And facing global climate change and everything is there are things that are beyond our imagination. And so Stevens is an example for me too. Is a very local poet. He doesn't drive. He walks every day 50 miles and pondering much bigger questions by talking about poetic translation and a statistical imagination. So to me, he's a great example of how poetry becomes poesis in a sense that we're actually deeply involved in world making and all unmaking for that matter. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this opening into Chinese Whispers. I love the book, and I really recommend it to all the people listening. And the one thing about your style in all your books is that it's absolutely a delightful combination of intricacy and intimacy. Now, I should say before we go, you have another kind of set of books. This is the third of your critical books, and you have your Charlie Chan book and the book about the Siamese twins, but I think you have another book coming out. So maybe we should just end with a little teaser for that, because that'll be the next big
So
event.
the other trilogy, which I just finished, the third book is on Yunte Huang, is a biography, Daughter of the Dragon, and it's coming out in August next year. So, thank you.
Okay, good to be here.
Okay, thank you all.
Well, that was such a delight, very stimulating, and really such a pleasure to have you back again after many years. Charles Bernstein, thank you for doing the honors. Really appreciate that. And I want to remind everybody, we have posted links with which you may purchase copies of Chinese Whispers and numerous additional titles from both our authors. And better yet, if you're in the neighborhood, come on down, browse our stacks. We're open 7 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 11 to 8, and also Friday through Sunday, 11 to 9. We're slowly getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. Of course, City Lights is a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We continue to publish poetry, literature and translation, and nonfiction with a progressive political outlook. You can always check out our titles at citylights.com. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. Best for the season. We hope to see you all again soon.